Welcome to Taming the High Cost of College. In this episode, we're going to talk all about attending college in Canada.
You have kids, they grow up, and before you know it, it's time to plan for college.
Where do you start?
How much is it going to cost?
Will you qualify for financial aid?
Should you be looking into scholarships?
When will you be able to retire?
What about student loans?
The list of questions is never ending. The good news is, all the answers are right here. Welcome to the Taming the High Cost of College podcast. Here is your host, certified financial planner, Brad Baldridge.
Hello and welcome to Taming the High Cost of College. I'm your host, Brad Baldridge. In this episode, we have a great interview with Brandon Miller. He is an immigration professional. He understands what it takes in order for a student to consider attending college in Canada. There's also some interesting benefits about potentially becoming a Canadian citizen, of course, in addition to your U.S. citizenship, if that's where you're coming from. So there might be some additional interesting benefits around college in Canada. Top of that, I think there's some price differences that may make a big difference for some families. And of course, there's all types of colleges. This might be something that you would do as a high-end student, looking to, instead of going to the Ivy League or Cambridge, you could go to the high-end Canadian schools. But certainly a lot of average students could do this as well. Again, the B average student or the A+ student, but not real strong student. And why would you do it? Well, again, it's something that looks a little different on your resume. I think it gets kids out into the real world a little bit more, and it broadens their perspective. I think a lot of students are in a tiny little bubble in their suburban high school or their urban high school or whatever it might be. And often that bubble doesn't change a whole lot when they go off to college. So by perhaps choosing to go to Canada, I think some families would, afford their student an opportunity to see the U.S. from a different perspective. I know Brandon talks about his time overseas, and when I went and studied overseas as well, it's interesting as an example to watch the news and hear about the U.S. from a different perspective. And I think that perspective is important, that in the global world that families start to understand, and especially where appropriate, students start thinking on a global scale, because that's where the world is going. All right, let's go ahead and jump into the interview. Today I'm sitting down with Brandon Miller. He's an immigration professional in Canada. He has a website, mysecondpassport.ca. Welcome, Brandon.
Thanks, Brad. Good to be here.
All right, so obviously you deal with immigration in Canada. What does that have to do with the typical parent of a student here in the U.S.?
Well, we deal with a lot of U.S. students, actually, and more over the coming years. So a lot of people are looking to Canada not only for school, but also for the benefits that surround that. So some of the benefits being some of the more tangibles, which are sometimes cost savings, and some of the other more future benefits are things like getting a second passport in Canada and having options for the future, such as work or healthcare or education or things like that.
Right. So in essence, some students now or parents are looking to Canada and saying, hey, why don't I go to college in Canada? And I can see how there's maybe some benefit to that. I think a lot of families now are maybe trying to spread their wings, do something different. I mean, in the past, I think even in your history, sometimes people will put on the backpack and off they go to some foreign country, and maybe they study there, maybe they just live there for a year or two. But it seems like Canada is not starting to welcome students, or has been welcoming students to come to Canada to study.
Yeah, so you raise a few good points. So a little bit about my story there. I was actually graduating school, and one of the best decisions that I made was to go overseas and teach in Korea, which was absolutely fantastic. Changed my life a lot. But a lot of what we've seen over the years is that international students have grown like exponentially. It's turned into like just a major growth area for Canada. And I always comment sometimes where, you hear in the news, sometimes they'll talk about, softwood lumber disputes between Canada and the US. And I'm like, forget about the softwood lumber, because in terms of the amount of money that is entered into the economy, it's not the lumber industry where that comes from. It's mostly international students. It's that big, and it's that actually that much growth has come out of it over the number of years for Canada. So, we have some world-class education here, and people from all over the world are coming here to access that.
Right. Absolutely. I think in the U.S., we've got a little bit of a U.S.-centric mindset where, again, everything revolves around the U.S. if you're a U.S. citizen, typically, and you don't really think much about studying elsewhere. And again, maybe study abroad programs come up, and I think a lot of families would take advantage of study abroad. That's also growing leaps and bounds at the U.S. universities where you can actually go do a study abroad. But this would be different, where you could actually choose to go to the University of Toronto or McGill or some of these other schools that, again, a lot of them are world renowned, and study there for the full program. Now, if you're going to do that, I mean, you need to have a passport. Do you need to, what are the rules? Do you need to get shots? I mean, what does it really take to cross the border and actually stay there for a year of school?
So do you get shots? It's funny. I kind of chuckled about that because I just brought in a student from the southern US, and she does not have her shots and was able to, there's certain exemptions that are available for that. So the answer to that is yes, it's advisable, but no, it's not actually mandatory because there are actually exemptions. And during the whole pandemic, there were those exemptions in place because students are such an important part of the economy. In terms of being able to come here as a student, most people are very uninformed. And I'm really, really happy that we're speaking today because they're uninformed about how easy it is to actually come and study here. I'll give you an example. When somebody comes in from the United States is the only country where you can actually carefully prepare your paperwork and drive up to a border or get on a plane and fly into Toronto and say, I want a study permit. Here's my papers. And you can actually get that granted to you right at the port of entry with flying in. It's that simple. I've done it in the last couple of months. I've done it with a number of students because it's September intake, right? People have come in. But yeah, you require a passport, you require admission into a school. And other than that, a few other key documents, a study plan, explain what you're doing, why you're studying, what that's going to do for you. And you're good to go. You will get your study permit at the border, and you'll also have the ability to come here and work while you're going to school.
Oh, interesting. So I think in many situations that I've seen around study abroad and that type of thing, you get a student visa or a student waiver so that you're allowed to stay for a relatively long time, but generally it precludes work. Well, what you're saying is that typically in Canada you can work while you're studying and that type of thing?
Absolutely. So the way it works with student visas is that you can come in as a student and you can work part-time 20 hours a week while you're going to school. Or if you're getting a job, say as a teaching assistant or something along those lines, then there's less limitation around that. And then when you take a break in the summer, you'll be able to work full time, like as much as you want. You want to work 100 hours a week? Sure, you can do that. So yeah, one of the benefits is that once you get a student visa here, you can actually work while you're going to school, and during breaks, you can continue to work as well. On top of that, while we're addressing work, one of the other benefits to people is that once you graduate school here, you can get what we call a postgraduate open work permit. And what that means is that once you graduate school and you've done that, you can apply for this postgrad work permit. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to work any job that you want and gain valuable Canadian experience that you can parlay into a Canadian passport. If you go to school for 1 year, you'll get a 1 year open work permit. If you go to school for 2, 3, 4, 10 years, the maximum you can get is a 3-year open work permit from there. And this is actually the reason that we do this is that the Canadian government wants to see people come here. They want to see them learn, get into the Canadian system, and also be able to set themselves up for an opportunity to stay here if that's what they want to do. And there's so many more benefits, especially to Americans, to have not only a Canadian passport, but also a US passport too.
Yeah, so let's touch on that a little bit. So if I get a Canadian passport, I'm not giving up my US citizenship. Am I then considered a dual citizen, or what does that mean?
Absolutely. That's a great question. So you're actually considered dual citizen. As an American citizen, you can hold 2 passports. You can have a Canadian passport and a US passport. But the benefits to that are pretty big. And if you take somebody who's a young person, now, again, I want to be careful here because I'm not a tax expert, but I do deal with a lot of clients that have both citizenships. Canada and the US have tax treaties in place, which allow people to strategically plan their tax affairs so that it's most beneficial to them. So you can ride that out with different citizenships, and you're not going to be double taxed. you're only going to pay the difference depending on who it's owed to, either to the US or to Canada. So that's one facet. Another benefit is that it opens up a number of different working arrangements through different trade agreements. So, we all hear about different trade agreements, the USMCA or CUSMA or NAFTA, all these different things. But we hear about the trade portion of that. But along with any trade portion, there's also worker mobility provisions. Now, Canada has a number of agreements, like with South America or with Europe. We have the Comprehensive European Trade Agreement, and there's worker mobility provisions in there for people that have Canadian passports. The other thing that is of interest, usually that I hear from the American side, generally for longer term, is healthcare. We do have free healthcare up here and retirement benefits and things like that. Once you get a Canadian passport, you can take that, you can literally leave for 20, 30 years, come back and retire here and have full healthcare and live your life. So a lot of people see that as a longer term strategy, as something that they can do. So again, coming here to go to school, we hear about the savings that comes out of it. We hear about the life experience, and quite frankly, coming to Canada from the US, it is not like a huge cultural shift, right?
Right. Absolutely.
We're pretty the same, right? Like in a number of different things, we have a lot of shared cultural norms and whatnot. So it's not like, again, I remember when I got on the plane, it was literally 10 days from when it entered into my head to me being in Korea. And I'm sitting at the airport going, what the heck am I doing here? The only thing I recognized was the Coca-Cola sign and the Korean Air sign of the plane that I flew in on. And that's it. Like culturally, it was very different. So that's always nice, the cultural experience. And then there's the future possibilities, which is the worker mobility, the healthcare, the tax savings, all the different benefits that come to that.
Right. I mean, that reminds me of a situation I had long ago when you talk about the Canadian passport. But when I was young, and in college, I actually did a study abroad. And then I studied in London, and while I was there, we did some traveling around, and I ran into a British citizen and essentially said, well, I'm going to pull out my Canadian passport when we go to these countries, because right now British citizens aren't revered real well and nobody knows anything about Canada. So if I use my Canadian passport, I'll pass under the radar and avoid, some of the intense screening that would be appropriate with my UK passport.
That's actually a really good point, because there's that leg of it too. But there's also, for instance, some countries I don't have to get a visa for, right? And there's differences between the US and the Canadian passport in terms of if you're traveling. You could whip out your Canadian passport, for instance, and have the ability to stay for 6 months, as opposed to, say, some countries where the US passport will give you like 21 days. So there's a number of different things. And increasingly with this, digital nomads and geography becoming less of an issue, people can work and study anywhere they want, or travel and live, it's great. So yeah, that's a really good point too. Yeah, for certainly the convenience of travel.
Oh, for sure. And I think again, when I was young and did study abroad, it was kind of unique and special. I think study abroad is becoming much more routine in the US, where at least US is starting to think globally a little bit. And I think there's a huge benefit to US citizens getting out in the world and experiencing other cultures and that type of thing. Now, again, Canada's maybe kind of a baby step, because it's not like, again, not going to the Far East or somewhere where you can't speak the language. Generally, you can mostly understand Canadians. Exactly. But anyway, I guess another question, as long as we're talking about language, there is the French part of Canada. So
absolutely,
we could, if we wanted to, go to Quebec and study there. Would that allow us to get some immersion in French and our classes taught in French? And how would that work?
Man, that's a great question. So yes, Quebec is largely French speaking. Here's a question for you. And this is a trick question, so I'll just tell you right off the bat. What is the one bilingual province in Canada? Okay. I'm not going to ask you to answer that, Brad, because I know it's a trick question. I just told you that, but it's not Quebec. Quebec is actually French as the first language, but New Brunswick is actually a truly bilingual province. But Canada's official languages are English and French. And a lot of people, if they want to pick up a language, McGill is in Montreal, for instance. We have a lot of interest with people that want to come up and study in Quebec because they want to pick up the French language as well. Now, it's a different type of French, in terms of there's a Quebecois component of it, but ultimately it's pretty similar to any French that's spoken around the world. But that's a great option for people that want to come in, pick up a new language. And I'll tell you, just as a side note, one of my favorite things is Quebec City. Quebec City, there's Montreal and Quebec City are the larger cities in Quebec. But Quebec City, I'll tell you what, it's like walking into, Europe like a couple hundred years ago. Like, it's just beautiful. If anybody wants to Google that, go check out, the Chateau Frontenac, and you can take a look and see what I mean. Like old Quebec, beautiful, just beautiful. So it's kind of like you're going to Europe, but you can drive to it. And there's a lot of benefits to that. A lot of benefits.
All right. So if we start to think about this, I think a lot of questions kind of flash through your brain. So, one of the obvious ones is, well, Canada's really cold. Why on earth would I go there? Can you speak to that a little bit? Because I happen to live in the United States, and I think I probably live farther north than you do.
Well, yeah, it's true, right? So Canada, actually, we do have 4 seasons. It can get pretty cold depending on where you are. But, to put that into context, 80% of the Canadian population lives within 200 kilometers of the US border, right? So if you really want to go north and you want to head up to, Northwest Territories or whatnot, then yeah, it's going to be cold. You're in the Arctic, for God's sakes, right? Like, it's going to be cold up there. But here's the thing. Vancouver, for instance, as an example, Vancouver is very temperate. It rains a lot there because of the proximity to the ocean, but it's not really snowing in Vancouver, but you can literally be on the beach in the day and skiing, in the afternoon, like, in the morning in the beach, and in the afternoon you could go for a ski and then be back to the beach. So you've got access to all of these different types of climates. If you're in Winnipeg, or as we like to call it in Canada, Winterpeg, it's pretty cold. It's actually can get pretty frigid there. But here's what I like to say, and as somebody who I did a little bit of time and lived in the Middle East as well, and it's hot. But people always ask me from there, they're like, oh, it's kind of cold there. I'm like, yeah, but you know what? When you're living in the desert, are you running around big sand dunes? No, you're going from aircon to aircon to aircon. And it's the same thing here. Like, you're literally moving from warm space to warm space. Might get a little cold from your front door to your car, or when you get into your enclosed transit space. But, if you look at the major cities here, like Toronto, for instance, you can literally walk the downtown core because there's an underground, they call it the path system, where it's all underground and all the buildings and everything are connected. And you can walk for miles and miles and miles. So all of these things are taken into account. It's not really that cold. I actually have learned to live it. I spent 8 years in the tropics, and I've come back and I'm like, yeah, I love winter. But
right.
but you're in an area where it's pretty cold, so you know exactly what it's like here.
Yeah, right, exactly. I mean, there are the 4 seasons, and Canada's not much different. At least some of the southern areas of Canada, certainly like Toronto, wouldn't be much different than New York City or where I am in Milwaukee. No. Toronto is relatively close to Detroit, as an example. The weather's probably not significantly different between those two. But there is winter, for sure. But there's winter in most of the northern U.S., too. So
I would say, though, the one thing I would like to point out on that, and this is just kind of ad hoc, I like to think that we're a little bit more prepared for winter. And I always see, like, you touched on New York, right? New York gets a snowfall, and they don't have the snow removal and the different things there because it's not really something that's there. So the chaos doesn't ensue as much when we have these big winter storms here, because it's just kind of the way it works, right? Right. I remember as a kid, I was like, yay, snow day. Did you get snow days? Do you remember those? Or?
Yeah, they happen here as well.
I love those.
Right. It's got to be pretty serious, though. And again, we always joke when we see it on the news where 2 inches of snow in Dallas and it shut everything down. And it's like, right. Yeah, we need 2 feet or 3 feet of snow, and then things get shut down for a day or two.
Exactly.
Or the bitter cold. Occasionally it gets, minus 20 Fahrenheit, which my brain doesn't do Celsius. So what would cold be in Celsius?
Minus 20. So that's actually it gets a little bit colder than that if you get wind chill. So Celsius here, minus 20 Celsius, minus 10. It's at 0. Everyone's like, oh, it's 0, which is 32 degrees Fahrenheit. That's, that's still t-shirt weather up here,
Yep.
It's the wind that really kind of adds on to that. But Yeah. No, it's all good. You just have to dress for it and enjoy it. But
Right.
I'll tell you, I find that, winter for me, it allows me to appreciate the summer and the spring that much better. And I always liken it to one of the best days of the year for me is like the first kind of warm spring day when people are bringing out their bicycles and you've got somebody that's got their the windows down in their car and they've got some music going and stuff. You're like, oh, summer's just around the corner. So it allows us to appreciate it that much more. And I think that's the blessing of winter.
Okay. Now, as far as the application process, I know here in the US, obviously, we used to rely heavily on the SAT and the ACT test, which were kind of our college admissions tests. They're starting to go away as becoming test optional and some of that, but are there tests or that type of thing in Canada that we'd have to be dealing with, or how does it work there?
So it generally varies depending on the school, but the US tests are generally not as relevant. Most universities will accept the SAT scores as a way for applicants to meet the requirements. Even if the program doesn't require them, the test scores can be a great addition to an application. Again, it really does depend on the school. And while not all schools will require the students to provide a proof of SATs, their school grades are the most important thing. And that's generally what people are looking at. So again, some schools will offer their own admissions testing as part of the process. But I can tell you right now, I'm dealing with somebody today, and one of the requirements is an English test. And we're kind of laughing because the person had done an English test for immigration purposes. And it's better than most native speakers. So they're seeking an exemption. So what you need to understand is that it really is on a case-by-case basis. Not all schools are going to require the SATs and whatnot, but it's important to have a plan of what you want to do and where you want to go. And then you can look at the scores and different things there or just the application procedure, I should say.
Right. And then obviously there's some of the top schools, but there's also, schools that are, we always talk about that in the US, people are hyper focused on Harvard and Yale and the other name brand schools, the top 25 or top 50, whatever it might be, that everybody's heard of. But again, those schools tend to take, the best and the brightest, and everybody else goes to their state universities or the other private schools that don't cater to, the elite student. So I'm assuming Canada would have a wide swath of students. They would have elite schools all the way down to, the B student type schools as well. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think, everybody in the world has heard of the Harvards and the Yales and all of the Cambridges and the Oxfords and all these different schools. And I think it's just basically, as I like how you put it, the name brand recognition, right? But there are so many great schools out there, and Canada is no slouch in that department at all. Like, if you look at UBC, McGill, or University of Toronto, consistently in the top 50 and world surveys, depending on which survey you look at, those are the schools that show up when you start speaking about Canada. I can tell you, I just brought a student out of Cornell who had a full scholarship in both Cornell and University of Toronto. I don't want to get too much into the details because I do got to respect the privacy, but they were in the sciences and they also had a European full scholarship. So needless to say, he was a very bright individual. He chose to go to U of T in this program. And I asked him, I said, wow, that's interesting, because he was already at Cornell. And I said to him, I was like, why are you, that's a pretty good school. He's like, listen, the opportunity that's there and the type of research that I want to do, that's the school that I want to be at. And I was like, very good to know, right? And again, speaking of U of T, I always comment, like, if you actually do your research, you look at some of the things that have gone on at the schools there, like insulin, right, was discovered at University of Toronto. Like, these are the little things that, like, there's great academic institutions, but it's difficult to compete with the name brand schools, and it's funny. I've got I just thinking back, this just popped into my head from my Korea days. There was a Korean drama, and I know everybody's into K-pop and all the different things these days. But when I was there was a drama series that was on. It was called Love Story at Harvard, right? What a great marketing, not strategy, but a great name recognition. You've put that into mainstream culture. And I think that's actually what's happened is with a lot of the schools. But I think if people are actually diligent, they do their work, they can find a lot of really great opportunity for a number of different schools. And Canada is is obviously at the table and the top spots in a lot of those academic institutions worldwide.
Right, for sure. So obviously we've got competitive schools, but if I look at the list of some of the Canadian schools, there's probably 40-ish that are eligible for U.S. need-based aid. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So it's not only the high-end name brand schools that you could consider. You could go to a smaller private school or a smaller public school that, again, isn't necessarily going to be as competitive. It's not like, well, I can choose between Harvard and University of Toronto, which is great for that top student. But you could also choose between your local state school that happens to be in your town or the local state school in your town in Canada. And not necessarily, again, you get the change and that type of thing, but it's not as competitive and it's not, just the uber elite that we're talking about here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I might be naive, but I would like to think that anybody who's a decent student can get into any school here in Canada. And again, I got to be careful because I'm an immigration professional, right? But I do deal with a lot of students. And just from my own experience, like I know when I went to post-secondary education here, and it wasn't the process, like going to school, trying to get into a school in the United States. And from my understanding, it's a job in itself in terms of what you have to do to go through, like whether it be the financial side or the interviews or the prep that you have to do. That's my understanding anyways, but we don't really have that type of system here. And it depends on the different program, but that type of stuff doesn't really exist here in that respect. And I like to think that all of the educational institutions in Canada are within reach of anybody who has the academic props to be able to do that. And that doesn't only mean for admissions, but it also means financially too. It's not, you don't have these wild swings in terms of tuition rates for schools.
Right, absolutely. All right. So as I mentioned, there's quite a list of Canadian schools that are part of the U.S. financial aid system, which means that at a minimum, you should be eligible for U.S. student loans and perhaps some grants and other federal aid as well. So I think that's a little, an additional benefit. Now, there are schools all over the world that are part of the federal system, not just Canada, but Canada has a lot of them. So I think Canada might be a good place to explore. And again, for someone that's looking to maybe not go all out and go overseas, truly, way overseas, and just say, well, we'll cross the border and go to Canada and start there. But I think it gets you out of the U.S. bubble and gets you thinking globally. I think there's a huge benefit to that. If people want to learn more about this whole process and how you can help and all that type of stuff, where can we get more information?
So I actually have a page that's set up only for US students because, as I noted earlier on, it truly is unique. It truly is a unique application process for US students as opposed to other nationalities to come to Canada. And there's so many different benefits to that. But if they want to go to mysecondpassport.ca/US students, on there, that'll be information that will answer a lot of the common questions that we see. And there's a lot of information there with the type of offerings that we have to be able to facilitate this whole process for somebody who wants to come in here. The type of things that people need to think about in that respect are, there's the immigration process, which is very simplistic for somebody coming from the US who has an offer of admission from a Canadian school. And then on top of that, there's the admissions process. And then, obviously the logistics of being able to physically locate up here and get settled in and get on the ground. So that's the type of resources that would be there. And yeah, if they want to go take a look and learn some more, that's the place to start.
Yes. And we will put links to this webpage and some of your other web pages in the show notes. This is episode 132. So you can go to tamingthehighcostofcollege.com/132, and there'll be links to Brandon's stuff and other information and notes on this as well. All right. Well, it was a great chat on Canada, and I'm sure we will talk again. Any final thoughts as far as what Canada has to offer that U.S. people may not quite understand?
Final thoughts. I'll give you a final thought. And I think it's directed at mostly, especially younger people and maybe their parents as well. I know for me, one of the best things that ever happened to me is I was graduating university and I was going to go right into law school, or I had some different job offers and I had law school ahead of me or grad school. And I decided to go make a sharp left and go teach English in Korea for a year. I ended up staying for 4.5 years, and it was the best thing that I ever did. I like to think of school and education, especially higher education, as an opportunity to learn and also grow as an individual, and not only academically, but professionally and spiritually, and any type of growth that you're looking for. And I think that going abroad and learning about different places and different ways of doing things is just a benefit that comes along with your traditional school. And I think that this is a really good opportunity to do that. On top of that, there's also the other added in benefits there for everybody. And I think it's just a wonderful opportunity for people. And I'm happy that, we live in a day and age where these things are so easy now. So
right.
That would be my final thought, Brad.
Yep, I would agree. I mean, the world is getting smaller as we can become more and more global. And I think people with some experience and history and a better understanding of the broader world will be valuable in the job market, as well as just, better citizens wherever they land.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Again, we'll put everything in the show notes. And again, we'll probably talk again.
Thanks again, Brad. I really appreciate it.
All right. That was a great interview with Brandon. If you can't tell, both Brandon and I are very excited about the idea of getting out there and seeing the world and doing something a little different. As I mentioned at the top of the show, I think it helps students to get out there and get some perspective and to have something to talk about in interviews when they're going on to grad school or when they're going on for their first job. But they have something to talk about besides, I studied hard in school and I got good grades. Of course, this isn't the only way. You certainly can go to school in Canada. You can do study abroad. Of course, we talked about gap year in the previous episode in 131, so that would be another way to differentiate yourself. Then, of course, there's internships and co-ops and all kinds of things where students can get out in the real world as well. But I think you need to start understanding these options and start building them into your college curriculum, because in the end, just getting a bachelor's degree is not all that different from everybody else. So I think there's a challenge out there where, again, you need to do something different. You need to be able to advocate for yourself. You need something that you can highlight while you're looking for jobs, looking for the next step. And I think the reality of it is when you do these types of things, you grow as a person, you get out of your bubble, you learn new things. So I would encourage people to, think about, again, Canada is one option. It's necessarily not the only option, but I think it's interesting. And there's lots of other ways you can go as well. As always, show notes are available. As I mentioned earlier, this is episode 132. So if you want to get links to Brandon's stuff, you can go to tamingthehighcostofcollege/132. And right there on the page will be links to Brandon's website and pages and information. We appreciate any sort of ratings and reviews. And please share this with your friends and family or anyone else that you know that might benefit from learning more about college planning. We'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Taming the High Cost of College podcast. Now it's time for you to take action. Head to tamingthehighcostofcollege.com for show notes, bonus content, and to leave feedback for Brad. The next step on your college journey starts now.
Brad Baldridge is a registered representative of Cambridge Investment Research and an investment advisor representative of Cambridge Investment Research Advisors, a registered investment advisor. Securities are offered through Cambridge Investment Research Incorporated, a broker-dealer and member of FINRA and SIPC. Brad owns two companies, Baldridge Wealth Management and Baldridge College Solutions. The Baldridge companies are not affiliated with Cambridge Investment Research.